It's just after noon Central Time, which means it's my privilege to welcome you to today's Alumni Career Programs webinar, Getting to the Interview, presented by Josephine Cai. The Alumni Career Programs Office is committed to helping provide alumni with the resources they need to stay competitive in an ever-changing job market and support the alumni community with career resources, networking channels, and job search capabilities. Today's webinar is co-hosted by UChicagoGRAD, an office committed to serving the graduate and postdoc community, focusing on recruitment, skills and experience, career development, and alumni engagement. Today's webinar is presented by Josephine Cai. She is the Assistant Director of Graduate Career Development for UChicagoGRAD, and she has over a decade of recruitment and career coaching experience. Josephine will discuss the documents most important to your job search. She will lead us through the do's and don'ts of your job documents, from how to craft your bullet points to the highlights you should mention in your cover letter. She will also leave time to answer your questions at the end of today's presentation. So let's get to the reason we're all here today, and let me welcome Josephine.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for tuning in and spending your lunch hour with me. It's my pleasure today to present the topic on looking at how to conduct your resume and cover letters most effectively for job applications. Allow me to spend some time to introduce myself. As Ali mentioned, I have about a decade's worth of experience in recruitment and career coaching, and I spent about 5 years of my career pretty much doing recruitment for the banking and finance industry. I want to share a little bit more about the kind of stories I've seen from the recruiter's point of view, and I'll be peppering my presentation with some anecdotes about the kind of candidates I've seen and what are some of the best practices going forward, and how you can kind of navigate the process smoothly and avoid potential pitfalls. So let me start with first introducing a little bit about what resume and cover letters are about, as well as the finer points about how to write a good resume, and I will spend some of the time covering cover letters. Ali will be taking questions, and I will definitely be answering all of them at the end of the webinar. I'll also be leaving some of my contact details, so in case you have any further questions, you can always feel free to be in touch with me later. So let me first start with resume format and conventions. So I will take some time to go through what exactly are the differences between a resume and a curriculum vitae, because I think a lot of people are concerned about what exactly are the differences between these two documents. So as you can see from my presentation, basically the difference is pretty obvious. Usually a CV is used to apply for graduate school as well as academic jobs, and they are entirely different from the presentation you would give towards a resume, which is pretty much what we call like a professional snapshot of who you are. So a main difference between the two documents would be the fact that within a CV, you typically tailor it for the application, including publications that you've actually written, and there is no page limit on how far you can go. So sometimes there are candidates who have written CVs that go as much as 10 pages, there are those who have stuck with 2 to 3 pages, and then they have an entire list of their projects, conferences, presentations, publications, and those are the kind of material you would need in a CV so that you can best present yourself for the academic job market. If you look at what happens within a resume, typically we call it like a concise snapshot of who you are as a professional. It's acutely tailored for each application, and there are no publications that are listed. Pretty much we use bullets to talk a lot about what you've handled and what are some of the things that would be of value to the employer, and we typically advise you to keep it within a page. If need be, no more than 2 pages, but usually 1 page should settle the presentation of a resume pretty well. So what are some of the things that we need to look out for when we start sending out resumes to recruiters? I think it's fair for me to say that most recruiters who have been through the recruitment process, we're out with a mission, and the mission is selection. And selection typically involves a lot of elimination. So what we do is every time there is a job that's posted in the job portal of a corporate website, or it could be within, all the different types of job portals out there in the market. We're looking at, say, Indeed.com or Monster.com, eFinancial Careers. These are all public listed roles, which I think a total of anything from 200 to 1,000 applications come in just for one specific role. So I should think that recruiters typically spend about 30 seconds glancing through your resume. And then, you know, the process of elimination kicks in really fast. There are 3 piles. We typically shortlist them to. So one, the first pile, the must-haves, the types of candidates that we know that we definitely have to meet. We typically put them into the shortlist pile. And I would think that that is the pile that has anything ranging from 5 to 10 resumes, no more than that. We have another pile that we are pretty unsure whether or not that person would be the most outstanding candidate for the job based on the paper qualifications we are seeing and the kind of experiences the candidate has outlined. But we think that there is some merit to the kinds of experiences the candidate has, and they are put subsequently into what we call the KIV folder, which is the Keep in View folder. So they are known as candidates within, say, the top 30 to 50 within the list, but you know, we're unsure whether or not they will be the candidates that we really, really want to shortlist. So of course, there is the third pile, the types that we reject almost immediately within 30 seconds. If we find that, you know, the way you're presenting yourself is definitely not tailored for the job, and whatever you are listing about yourself makes no sense whatsoever, chances are we will not be getting in touch with you. And I think it depends on the recruitment practice of each and every company. Some recruiters may get back to the candidate and say you are not, you know, your application is not successful. They may have done it through a system prompt, and you can get like an automated email within, say, the next 2 to 3 months after applying for a job. But I should think that majority, it's pretty much like you send in the resume, you may get an automated reply that says, thank you for sending it in. We'll be in touch with you if you are selected. So if within the next month or 2 you don't hear back from the recruiter, chances are you have not been selected, but there hasn't been any notification that you're rejected either. So just take it that anytime you don't hear from a recruiter within the 3 months that you send a resume, it's safe to assume that, you know, you probably don't stand a chance of being interviewed. So typically what we look for in a resume, I will definitely cover that with you, but I should think that, you know, those candidates who really, really have great resumes, who pretty much tailor it according to what the job is about, will be interviewed. And the objective of writing a great resume is to be getting an interview, and that is the objective of why you write a resume. So I will cover some of the fonts that you should be using in a resume. There are some pedestrian fonts that I definitely advise against you using. Fonts that are pretty popular actually, Arial, Times New Roman, Calibri, Cambria, and Comic Sans. I should think that all of these fonts would not be one that make your resume stand out, and I would have a list that I would prefer that you look at, so that at least, you know, when you start using these fonts, you can kind of look at the look and feel of your resume when you start presenting them on Word or in PDF. And you can see some of the differences, you know, between, say, a size 11 to size 12 of a resume. Anything smaller or anything bigger in terms of font size will probably take up too much space. Any smaller, you're probably going to find that it's not exactly the most easy to read resume, and sometimes recruiters are not the youngest people, so I should think that if you're considerate, keep it to, you know, size 11 and 12. Also, if you look at, say, what are some of the format in terms of the space that you're allocating to the margins of your presentation, I should think that you should try to keep it to, you know, something that's easy to read, but you're trying to use as much white space as possible. So try to use a 0.7 to 1 margin around for, you know, all around for the document. You can easily set that through, say, for example, if you're doing it in Word, you can set the margin and custom it accordingly. So this is an example of how a resume can look like, and I should think that, you know, some of the principles and fundamentals of writing a resume would be pretty universal. First up, if you're looking at, you know, using the contact details portion, the first section in the resume, you should have no more than 2 lines, typically just your name, and the name has to be in the biggest font because it's kind of like the signboard. And then you're going to have, you know, the address that you're staying in right now, your contact number, as well as your email address. You can choose to use your UChicago email address if you still have it, or any other email address. Just make sure that it's not an address that doesn't spell your name in full. You know, if you're William Harper, try to use first name, last name at gmail.com, for example, instead of, say, Casanova88, you know. So just make sure that it's professional. So, of course, typically we will advise a few sections. The first is usually education, but I know for some of you who may have extensive work experience and you may have left school for a while, it's safe to actually replace the education section with work experience first, and you can shift education to a lower portion of your resume. What we are going to look at would be in terms of, say, for example, if I'm covering the education first, it's useful to bring up, if, say, relevant coursework that you may have done in school. You know, if you have got an impressive GPA, feel free to write that down. If you have great experience studying overseas, feel free to also list that. Just know that, you know, you can typically use this section to highlight certain things that would be academically relevant for the job. So say, for example, maybe some of you may have, you know, graduated with like a master's in financial mathematics, and you know that you know, you want to get into, say, the banking and finance industry doing quantitative research. It'll be useful to list some of the modules that you have taken in that particular area, just so that you can say, yes, I've handled modules like these, some of my coursework revolve around that, and you can, you know, take the opportunity to list 1 or 2 projects in detail within the education section that best, you know, showcases those technical skills that are relevant for the job. Sometimes study abroad opportunities would be useful if you want to show, you know, interesting ways that you have acquired language skills, or sometimes it could be the fact that you have got great experiences overseas doing volunteering or some types of immersion program, and you want to highlight, say, your adaptability as well as the way you have, you know, kind of just adapted to a totally new education system altogether. So those are interesting, you know, those are interesting experiences that you can highlight under education. And I should think that if they are really pretty outstanding opportunities, you can even have a section, you can choose to term a separate section for them and call it like overseas experience, for example. So headings, typically when we look up at the different sections, the headings, you know, you try to use a slightly bigger font for that, or you can keep that in caps so that it stands out, and then you list maybe the institution you're with, the organization you're with, as well as your title. And of course, we try to keep bullets consistent. So if you are using square bullets, make sure that it's square bullets all the way. They are with the same alignment. If you're using round bullets, then make sure that it's consistently round bullets. If you have space in between the 2 different rows, say for example, in this particular slide, between Department of History and the Art Institute of Chicago, you can tell that the white space in between is largely consistent. So you just keep you know, consistency, one of the you know, one of the signboards in your resume. Then of course, when we next look at, you know, the types of experiences, we try to keep it latest experience first, so it's reverse chronological. You know, the most relevant experiences on top, and each section when you write whatever you have covered in that particular area, we start with a broad bullet, and then subsequently each bullet in that section becomes more and more specific. I'll definitely go through with you later on in the presentation what are some of these things and the techniques you can use to make sure that you are teasing out specific information in each section that's relevant for the employer. You make sure that each bullet that you put in, you make sure the competency action verbs you're using are on the left. We typically advise against using compounded bullets, so make sure that you're using the same bullet for each and every line in your resume, and we use you know, all important information on the left side of the resume. As for the right side of the resume, it's typically to keep the dates, and you can tell from this particular template that, you know, it's pretty easy to read. The eye flow is pretty between white space and text, pretty easy. There's some level of, you know, there's some level of I would say relevance in terms of how you're scoping it, and I think that's something that we should definitely be you know, looking at in terms of a good template. So as I mentioned, when you write align dates, do make sure that it's also consistent. So if, say, the alignment is all the way towards the border, then make sure that all the dates are right aligned towards the border. So as I mentioned earlier, when we look at, say, the education section, you can choose to put it on the top or the bottom of the page. And I would say only include degree-based programs. I know some of you may have done, say, courses relating to massive open online courses that you may have taken up, maybe with regard to machine learning, and you think these are important courses that you may want to list down on your resume. Chances are there will be a section later. If you put them down towards the end, you can include additional certifications that you may have gotten through professional organizations, as well as those that you may have done through massive open online courses. So I would say keep that maybe towards the bottom of the page. We keep degree-based programs within the education section. So in your case, I should think that some of you, if you really want to highlight certain dissertation and academic advisors that you've worked with, it's safe to put that in the degree section under wherever you have completed that course of degree, and what are some of the interesting projects you want to highlight. But I should stress that in the typical resume, I wouldn't say go beyond 20% for this particular section, because I should think that the bulk of your experience would be the practical work experience that you've gathered. And then, work experience and other parts of your resume should be forming the bulk of what you have to say, rather than keeping the attention on education. So the advice I would have is try not to have it exceed 20% of the space you're allocating to a resume. So I think that it's safe to assume that, many people have very, very different types of interests. You may have top 3 choices of careers that could be very different from each other. One suggestion that I would have for that is you can start with a master resume that's containing all your experiences. That's just for your eyes only. You can keep it to, 1 page, 2 page, 10 pages, that doesn't matter. But do have a master copy that you can work around. So for each and every application that you're sending out, you can start from scratch and reassemble it from scratch. And that's probably one of the best ways you're ensuring that you're tailoring your resume to the individual jobs you're looking at. You should definitely be analyzing the different job descriptions that you're applying to, because you need to make sure that you're using the right words, and you should convey the same tone of what the job entails. So if you see that a lot of what happens in the job description is pretty much about collaborative action verbs, and you see a lot of things like teamwork, collaboration, facilitation, development, then chances are the way you scope your resume, you try to keep away from using dominant terms that involve, say, commanding, instructing. You can use a variety of different action verbs, of course. I do think that you should have some diversity, but do keep the general tone of your resume with the right kind of words. You can consider breaking up your resume into specific sections, so you don't have to squeeze everything within work experience if you think that there are a variety of different things. You may have done, academic work experience, you may have done analytical stuff in your projects, you may have project management experience, and you can actually sometimes have a combination like management and leadership experience, teaching and volunteering experience, or you can have project management and overseas experience. What matters is, have different sections, especially if they are relevant to the job. If, say, the job requires you to have some international exposure, it'll be good to maybe highlight a particular section that highlights your international experience. If the job really entails a lot of project management experience, then instead of just calling it work or professional experience, you may want to have the entire section known as project management experience. So that's why it's useful to tailor each and every resume based on, what the job entails. And then that definitely, can bypass a lot of the barriers that may go into eliminating your candidature through the recruitment process. I think sometimes it depends on the policy of the particular firm you're applying to, but in many cases, I think a lot of multinational organizations have moved their recruitment process to include what we call the applicant tracking system. So chances are sometimes, like, say, for example, you apply to a bank like JP Morgan, they will require you to fill in all the different information that they will have within their corporate careers page that pertains to application for candidates. And then, you know, as you pass your resume into the system, as you start filling in all, you know, that's required of you through the application process, you know, chances are when you go through that process, the first person that looks at your resume will probably not be a real person. It could be an algorithm or a system that really passes your resume through, you know, a series of keyword searches, and they will highlight maybe, you know, candidates with the most relevant keywords, you know, as a top 10 percenter within the list of candidates. So imagine if you have 200 candidates, those who make the top 10%, so the top 20 resumes that has the most relevant keywords will actually be, you know, kind of filtered in the system as the 10%, and that could be, you know, one of those resumes that the recruiter, which is the person that looks at your resume and, you know, start selecting, you know, candidates for interviews, will be looking at. So I think it's safe to assume that when you really do your homework and you are using the right words, the right types of, you know, the right text that's often used within, you know, say the values and culture of that particular firm, the way they're writing their job descriptions, and, you know, if they use a lot of project management type words, make sure that you have, you know, those kind of tenses and those kind of, you know, words in the resume, and pretty much just make sure, you know, that things that you can control and things that you cannot control. I think it's fair to say that what you can control is to just do your best and give the best version of the resume that is in line with the job requirements, and that will ensure that, you know, you pretty much can stand a fighting chance within the resume selection process. And what you cannot control, and that is whether or not the recruiter actually picks up your resume and says you are definitely one of those we need to interview. That bit you probably cannot, you know, control, and you really don't know what kind of competition you're up against. So I would say that till the point that you can control the process, and that is to give the best version of your resume that's in line for the job, you are definitely doing the right thing. And of course, you know, there are certain things that I would say are important as you start looking at different things within the experience section. As I mentioned earlier, you try to start each bullet within that section with a broad, you know, type of, a broad range of your responsibilities, and, you know, the kind of information that goes within the first bullet is a lot more about, say, oh, maybe you project managed 3 projects with, you know, a crew of 18 people looking at this and this industries. That could be, you know, the first bullet on your resume, and each subsequent bullet that you start putting into that particular section has to be more and more specific. So you can start highlighting what you did for one specific project out of the 3, and then as you start looking at each and every project in detail, you can highlight different parts of your role within a particular project and make that the basis of your project management experience. Of course, this is also the point where I have to say, you know, sometimes you may have spent, say, 5 years in a particular role, and you may have spent just 2 years in the next role that you went to, but you know that whatever you want to do next would be more related to the role that you spent 2 years in rather than the one you spent 5 years in. So I should say that at this point it's safe for you to start looking at how you can actually manipulate the length of your resume and make sure that the focus of what you have to say is within what you did in that 2 years rather than what you did in 5 years. So what I'm going to say next would be the fact that the proportion of information that you actually include for each experience do not have to reflect the actual work responsibilities. So, you know, it may be fair to assume that what you did in 5 years is way more than what you have done in 2 years, but you should definitely make relevance the guiding principle when you write a resume. So chances are you're probably going to give me more bullets on what you did in that 2 years because that's the job that's probably going to be more relevant for the application, and you should definitely allocate more bullet space for that experience rather than the one that you spent 5 years in. So this is the point where I mentioned that, you know, when you look at every different facet of your resume, be it the education section, the professional and project management section. You could have an awards and achievement section or a technical and language skills section. Try to have what I call like 80% relevance, 20% diversity quotient. So what do I mean by that? So if, say, you're applying for a role that has to deal with biomedical sciences, so when you're looking at a role like that, whatever you may have done, say, in graduate school may be highly relevant for the job. And maybe a long time back when you did your first internship back in college was a biomedical sciences internship, but in between maybe you would have done something else that is totally not relevant to biomedical sciences, but you definitely have the interest, and that's why you choose to come back to school and do graduate studies in that area. So I would say that if that is, where you want to head next, what you need to actually put into the resume has a lot to do with maybe some of the academic research project experiences that you're currently handling in graduate school. And you also may want to talk a little bit about that internship you did back in college, maybe a long time ago. And so the proportion of the resume should reflect, say, academic research experience, and, the bulk of what you have to say would be in that section. You can have, some percentage of your resume dedicated to some of the work experiences you may have done before you decide biomedical sciences is what you want. It could be something that you may have done for the main part of your career, but that shouldn't be the focus of your resume because that would be not relevant for the job that you actually want to apply for next. Then, of course, the diversity quotient, that's when that particular area will fit in. So you should not eliminate that area totally, but instead of, say, giving it 5 bullet space, you can choose to just have 2 bullet space to talk about that experience. So when you look at your entire presentation of the resume that you're tailoring for the biomedical sciences industry, 80% of what you have done relates to what you did in graduate school, as well as the research that you have done, and maybe a particular internship that may have that experience. And then 20% something else that you have covered, and then that should actually just, be a way of showing recruiters that I've done other things, but that is not, something that defines who I am. And you should try to keep your resume with that kind of principle. So at least, every recruiter knows that the relevance of what you're trying to sell would be there. And I would stress that the bulk of your working experience, research experience should occupy about 40 to 60% of the resume. So if you look at it in its totality, you have maybe 40 to 60% professional experience, research experience, and then 20% education, and you have maybe about 20% left for other types of skills you want to highlight. So in your case, it could be certifications that you've done, overseas experience, volunteering experience, as well as some of the technical and language skills that you possess. Okay, so I pretty much covered the slides that I just talked about earlier, and I want to highlight, say for example, if you have chosen to go with a format, say you choose to go with work experience and professional experience first, and then you can make the education section the following section, and you have more space, you're unsure whether or not you should actually have a technical language skills as well as additional information section. Chances are sometimes what you can do is you can have the last section known as additional information, and you can have different bullets relating to different things. So you can have one bullet that says you're proficient in certain programming languages or certain types of technical skills. So in this case, I've seen candidates write things like proficient in, say, C++, Java, R, Python, and then the next bullet goes something like fluent in, say, English and Spanish, both written and spoken. And then sometimes some people may want to add in just one more bullet to talk a little bit about their interests. That could be interesting, especially if what you want to say could be relevant to the job, or even if it's entirely irrelevant. Remember, I mentioned that there is a 20% diversity quotient that you can incorporate into the resume, so that would be something that you can think about. I've seen cases before where some candidates have included some of their really interesting hobbies. So some could be, really into sports and they say they're active triathletes, and there are those who say, oh, maybe they've backpacked, 3 continents on a shoestring budget of 10 grand. And then these are pretty interesting conversation starters. If you want to just mention this during the course of an interview. And I should think that they will be interesting, if, say, the interviewer or the recruiter you are hoping to impress actually also has something along those interests. Or it could be something interesting like you want to apply for a sports apparel company and you actually may have some experience in designing sports apparel, or you're an avid sports person. These could be interesting things that you want to highlight in just one bullet, 1 line maximum, no more than that, and call it an interest. You can say you're passionate about cycling, horseback riding, and something else. So if you want to highlight those, feel free to do that, but it's entirely optional. So if you have other things on your resume that needs that 1 bullet space more than anything else, make sure that you're allocating that for, say, your professional experience rather than additional information. Okay, so I'm moving on to how to write the resume better, and that is the final details of your bullet points. So this is the part where I want to highlight there is a specific tag known as the Competency, Action, and Results Framework. It's called the C.A.R. for short. It's really about how to formulate each and every bullet and make it as powerful as possible. And the whole point of you doing it is to make sure that you can actually imagine somebody doing that role. And the whole point of having that kind of bullet is to make sure that the interviewers can visualize you doing the job almost. And I think that's probably what a powerful bullet can encompass, the fact that you actually can visualize somebody doing that particular role. So in this case, I would have a cheat sheet that I can share with you. If you click on that link, you'll find that there are baskets of different competencies. You would have, data and financial skills, you would have communication skills, and those would have a corresponding list of the action verbs that you can use to start each and every bullet on your resume. So you begin with a strong action verb. So you can say you led this, you analyzed that, you organized this, you spearheaded, developed, pioneered, initiated, implemented. So we start each bullet with a strong action verb. We really make sure that it's not a complete sentence, so you don't need to have necessary punctuations like, commas and periods. Remember, it's bullet points, so 1 bullet should not exceed 2 lines. And so each and every bullet that you use, you're trying to encompass competency, the actions you took, as well as the end result. So some resumes may have things like, say, for example, refine targeting strategy for 2 fundraising events using this particular methodology, and then you can say you actually impressed the organizers or something like that. Or it could be a situation where you say, you recommended this strategy for senior management, and then, end result was implementation as well as the subsequent review of what you have actually recommended. So remember, whatever you are doing right now would be in the present tense, and then things that you may have done in the past, keep it to past tense. And then we try to avoid passive words like assisted, observed, helped, participated. It's perfectly fine if you are not taking a leading role in certain parts of the roles that you have actually highlighted. You can have 1 to 2 bullets that talk about, what you may have done in a more collaborative and supportive kind of basis. But the way to write that would be, instead of saying you assisted this professor in reading this particular lab sample, you can say something like, oh, you participated in this research in collaboration with this team and highlighted maybe some of the results that as a result of that particular research. So I would say try not to repeat the same action verbs. Try not to use the same action verbs at different points of your resume. You will definitely have opportunity to use different types of words to describe what you have done. So in this case, some examples that I would have in terms of action and results would be things like, say, maybe you want to highlight the fact that you are independent researcher, you have, independently drawn data from 300 sample patients, interviewed, 200 of them, and then, came up with the hypothesis that this and this is the case. So sometimes, you can actually be quite business-like in the way you write the resume, especially if what you're going towards the accomplishment of what you want to do is to make sure that you can get into business, and you want to show, say, for example, the fact that as a project manager of this particular organization for this particular role, you have increased revenue by 20% through maybe implementing certain cost-saving measures together with some new marketing strategy that can actually raise your bottom line by 20%. So these are some of the ways in which you can definitely pepper your resume to make sure that at different points of your career, there is a basket of skills that is transferable. It could be, in a role as a project manager, you've highlighted your communication and organizational skills. Before that, maybe in graduate school, you have done a lot of analysis as well as the ability to look at managing projects, people, and results. And then those are the things that you should actually highlight. And if the role you're applying for actually asks for a lot of your project management skills or your organizational skills, then make sure that you have a lot more of those bullets peppered throughout different parts of a resume in different roles that you've handled. So more examples in this slide. Instead of saying something like you led discussions, you can say you led weekly discussions with 18 undergraduates majoring in psychology. That could be the first bullet, and then you go into something that's a little bit more specific as you go through the different things that you want to highlight. Of course, sometimes there are sections where you may have been awarded certain types of achievements as well as certain types of prizes. It's perfectly safe to include that within the section that you've actually acquired that prize. So say, for example, under education, while you're studying at the University of Chicago, you've been awarded the Teaching Assistant of the Year award based on the performance in the class that you were teaching. You can actually highlight that particular award and achievement within education. If you have been, awarded, say, the best salesperson in your team for 3 quarters within that particular area of your work, feel free to actually highlight that, within the work experience section under that particular stint with the company, and you can say you consistently nailed the top salesperson award for 3 quarters from, say, 2012 to 2013. So that's one way to highlight certain awards and achievements. Sometimes if you want to highlight that separately, you can also choose to have an awards and achievements section just talking about some of these qualifications and awards that you've also got. I would say one way to really make sure that you're quantifying as much as possible, so that at a glance I'm able to see that whatever you have done within that area of what you want to highlight has a certain level of, say, prestige or selectivity or exclusivity. So say maybe you're 1 in 10 people selected to attend a conference for that particular quarter for something, you can choose to highlight that. Maybe you are 1 in 2 people awarded a scholarship for something, or you're 1 in 5 people awarded for the best customer service award in your team. Feel free to do that, because that's one way to make sure that you are actually highlighting how selective those awards, those achievements are. You can also definitely quantify through things like, say, you actually presented this to a class of, say, 30 people, or you actually manage a strategy through social media like, I don't know, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and you got, say, 3,000 participants within 3 months or something. So that's something that you can definitely use numbers to quantify. They can be percentages, they can be even investment in terms of man hours. So say, for example, you want to highlight how fast you learn a piece of software, or how fast you can actually contribute towards the work in your department. You can say you invested 20 hours a week on top of a 60-hour work week to ensure that you are able to do this presentation in R and create a visualization project within 2 months or something. So that's one way to definitely quantify your achievements. So I would say, try to diversify your competencies. You shouldn't be using a whole basket of words just talking about technical skills or data management skills or leadership skills and sidestep any other skills that are important for the job. So just think about the 80-20 rule that I mentioned, 80% relevance, 20% diversity. You should be spot on with what the role asks of you. If they want management skills, project skills, highlight that, but also make sure that there are other things that you can highlight other than those skills, because sometimes those diverse skills are probably what tips the recruiter towards you rather than the next candidate. Okay, so what are the transferable skills that you can still highlight? I know it's safe to assume that many of you may have done certain types of jobs that will not be directly relevant to what the role you're applying to will be about. So just think critically when you analyze the job description, the basket of skills that they're looking for, and whether or not you actually have covered those before. So say you spend 6 years in graduate school as a scientist. One way in which you can actually relate your research experience to what the industry requires would be, say, thinking about the lab as a small business enterprise, where other than working with your PI on looking at this and that, you can actually highlight certain things like, oh, maybe you manage a budget of how much in order to ensure that the project keeps on track. You can start thinking about, say, oh, maybe you communicated with 3 other researchers within the team to make sure that you can produce this type of results within the next quarter or the next phase of the project. So start thinking about, what you may have done within the scope of your work that can be transferable for what the role you're applying to entails. So sometimes these could be skills that you may have acquired through experiences like volunteering as well as extracurricular activities. Do have a section to talk about those, especially if you think that those are more transferable and those skills can actually be what will make your application a compelling one. So do actually make sure that you allocate space in your resume to cover that, especially if they are the transferable skills you want to highlight to the employer. So, in any role that you're applying to, do make sure that you can specifically pinpoint what the recruiter is looking for through the way they have written the job description. Chances are they're usually baskets of skills that relate to communication, teamwork, leadership, management, innovation, organizational skills. So do have a variety of different things that can bring up different points in your resume. Okay, so I'm going to cover, the next section, which is about cover letters. And it should be known that usually a resume is accompanied by a one-page cover letter. They come together as a package. So I usually use the analogy that if you go to an interview fully suited up, having a good cover letter pretty much means you're putting on a good pair of shoes rather than a pair of flip-flops. So it's really important that you try to give the best presentation possible, not just in the resume, but also the cover letter. And the good news is, when you've been through the process of, organizing the resume and trying to pinpoint relevance for the employer, you already know maybe what are some of the standout or crown jewels in your experience that would be relevant for the employer. So 1 to 2 bullets on the resume for a specific section can become the next paragraph that you write within the cover letter. Just the main difference is whatever happens on the resume is in bullet form. Whatever happens on the cover letter is written in prose. So that's the best way that you can actually start, showing your communication skills in the written form. And sometimes, the way you write, can ensure that your resume gets propelled to the top of the list rather than the bottom of the list, because the way you've written actually, fulfills the kind of communication the role is actually asking of. So good English, very succinct sentences, something that a recruiter can easily understand and know exactly what you're trying to sell. So this is a good platform to showcase a lot of different things that you can offer the job. So the basic structure for a cover letter would be the fact that we try not to go beyond 3/4 of a page, and we typically start with, I would say an outline of about 4 paragraphs. Use 1 to 2 key examples in your experience that you can convert into 1 to 2 paragraphs. And usually I would say if the first paragraph is about introduction, second paragraph and third paragraph should be highlighting specific stints that you may have with an organization or an academic institution, and then the final paragraphs usually about thanking the recruiter for their time and how you want to take it forward to the next steps. So for some who may have just pretty much highlighted the academic work experience, chances are whatever you may have done in your volunteering as well as other experiences can be used as 1 paragraph. So do know that you don't have to use both professional experience. You can actually change it up. You can use 1 paragraph space for professional experience, 1 paragraph space for research or academic experience, or you can change it, accordingly to what the job entails. So remember to research the company, use language that reflects how the company describes itself and its mission. And in this case, if you've actually known about the company through a contact or an employee that you have met, it could be, say, a recruitment or information gathering session with a particular employee, and you have actually heard from, one of the UChicago alums who were there for the presentation on what he or she has done in that job, and you want to highlight that conversation. That could be one way to cite your interest in the organization in the opening paragraph. And I want to highlight, do try to address the cover letter to a specific person. So some ways you can do it. First, you can always look at their corporate website to see who's in the management team. Some organizations do give a full list of who's heading each division and who are the people in recruitment and human resources. I would say there are 2 safe zones. The first zone would be the fact that you can always tailor the cover letter with a HR person in mind. It could be the recruitment manager, it could be human resources director. Chances are that person will be definitely looking at a resume at some point in the process. May not be the first or the last, but knowing that you can always quote somebody who's doing recruitment would be probably one of the safe zones. The next safe zone would be quoting somebody who heads the division that you're very keen to join, because I'm sure as a line manager, that person will definitely be looking at your resume at some point in time. So always aim for either the head of the division you're hoping to join or the recruiter who's handling recruitment for the organization, and you'll probably not go wrong with those names. So if you have not have a LinkedIn account yet, create one so you can actually use that to start, kind of shopping for names and people that you can address your cover letter specifically to. Okay, so I want to take some time to go through one of the cover letters that I've come across back in 2012, and that is something that I would just want to share so that you will not repeat the mistakes that this student has done. So this is a student, this is an application for investment banking for JP Morgan by an NYU student named as Mark. It's really quite interesting. So I'm just going to go through those slides and you can read through them right now. So I've actually highlighted the sentences in italics that I feel are the most ridiculous. And I would strongly advise against any of you committing the same mistakes that this student has done. You don't mention in your cover letter why you choose to leave a job, especially if it's too easy. Don't say things like that. Don't ever mention why you choose to leave a job, because I don't think it's professional. Until you have a real conversation face to face, I think these things should not be mentioned. You probably also shouldn't mention personal achievements like bench pressing double your body weight. This is definitely not a good example of achievements that you should be highlighting in a cover letter. Maybe in a social conversation, that would be a great, anecdote to share, but within a cover letter, please don't do something like that. So you can tell the candidate pretty much use this template for an application with JP Morgan, but probably the previous application was for Morgan Stanley. So do make sure that you don't do the same thing as he does. You can always keyword search the document that you're sending out to make sure that you are not sending it out to the wrong person, making sure that you are not including names of competitors. So these are very, very basic things. We should think that it's quite elementary, but sometimes these things do happen. I think there are little mistakes that can make or break your application, and this is one of them. Do read, double read, proofread, and make sure somebody else also eyeballs your cover letter and resume before you send it out, because sometimes, you just didn't catch it. So, terrifying efficiency, the fact that, he was promoted to a research assistant and the employer gave the title so that he could give me more work. I mean, I do think that candidate is being really honest sometimes, but don't write that in your cover letter. I repeat, please don't write it. And, don't even mention anything about the fact that you think egos can be a huge liability, because this person just pretty much blew the cover letter. So, this is a textbook example of what not to write in a cover letter, and I hope all of you will never have to read a cover letter like that ever again, and hopefully not write one yourself too. Okay, so what definitely should go on in a cover letter then, now that we've seen like an extreme example of what's a bad cover letter? So if you look at, as I mentioned, a generic cover letter outline, they're usually about 4 paragraphs. The first paragraph is about introduction, a specific reason for why you're interested in the company. It could be a conversation that you had with their current or past employees, alums that you've spoken with, seniors, and people that you've known. Another way to get information about why you're interested to join organizations would be to check out their press releases and check out their media newsrooms, because that's when you can get very up-to-date information that are being made public about a firm's strategy, if they're expanding in a certain market you're keen to look at, or if they're looking at the new product line or service line that's directly related to the area of work you want to go into. Sometimes, by keeping track of organizations that you're interested in and what are some of their latest business strategies, and you incorporate that into the way you write a cover letter, I think that makes a compelling case about your interest in the organization. And then, of course, I would say if you're highlighting distinct competencies, you can use competency number 1 in the next paragraph and relate why the example is useful and relevant for the employer. And of course, the subsequent paragraph, another competency, and then why it's actually interesting for the employer to know that. And then, of course, final paragraph, you end it off with a thank you note and that you look forward to next steps. So this will be an example of what makes a pretty good cover. I got this for my colleague Mike, who's I think one of the wittiest people I've met, because I've never seen a cover letter like this, and I think it's useful for all of you to check out the techniques that are being mentioned previously and why it's important. So first you look at the introduction, and then a specific reason for why you're interested in the company. In this case, the conversation between a specific person, and then of course 2 distinct competencies, A and B, that you want to highlight as transferable skills for the job. So the next paragraph, you are talking a little bit more about the competency that you just mentioned in the opening paragraph, the example of applying that, and why is that interesting for the company to know? So in the third paragraph, you're looking at restating the competency that you just mentioned, the example of applying that particular competency, and then linking that specifically to the company and the role. And then finally, the final paragraph is pretty, basic. It's just about 2 to 3 sentences. Thank you for your consideration. I look forward to hearing from you. And then that sums up what you need to cover in a cover letter. Okay, so at this point, I'll be happy to take questions.
Hey, Josephine, this is Allie back on the line. Thank you so much for this presentation today. We did have a question come in during the course of your presentation, and the question is, what resume or cover letter advice do you have for someone who is perhaps in their mid-career, but they're targeting a company that hires a lot of younger people in their 20s and 30s, specifically so that they wouldn't get eliminated immediately via a keyword search that's done electronically?
Okay, I think it depends on how much effort you want to take towards investing in that particular opportunity. I think one way to do it is sometimes there is a medium known as the hidden job market, and that's really about writing into somebody on an unsolicited basis. It could be that you're worried that if the first point of contact looking at your resume would be a machine or algorithm rather than an actual person. One way to sidestep that process, I'm not saying sidestep that totally, but one way to do it is if you know somebody within the organization. It could be an alumni contact. It could be just the fact that you want to write indirectly to maybe the CEO of that particular organization, especially if you think it's kind of like a startup type culture. Chances are their contact details would be quite easily accessible online. Write in directly to that person and introduce yourself. Tell him or her about your interest in his or her company, and that you would love to have an opportunity to meet with him or her for a chat to discuss, how you can actually be of service to them further. I think these are some of the ways in which you can ensure that somebody reals looking at your resume, especially if that person has a hiring decision power. But at the same time, if that person says like, oh yeah, maybe you should talk to the person handling HR for me, at least you are being directed somewhere, and you can always follow up to say, thank you, I'll definitely get in touch with him or her, and I will also be submitting my resume through the system. So that's one way to kind of keep within the guidelines. You are definitely going through the system. You're not trying to sidestep the process totally, but at the same time, you're trying to just maximize the chances of somebody's looking at a resume rather than the first elimination barrier being a machine.
That's great. Since we're running right out of time today, I think what I'm going to do is just ask one more question, and then I will email you, Josephine, with any remaining questions or comments out there, and ask you to respond that way, since you've been so generous with your email address. So the last question, so someone asked prior to the webinar, what's the best way to present temp jobs on a resume? They've had 3 in the last year, lasting 1 to 2 months each, and I think the concern here is making sure that it doesn't look like they're jumping around from job to job, but understanding that they are temporary positions.
Sure. Maybe a way that you can do it is, I know sometimes a lot of people will have a lot of freelancing gigs that you did, and those also include temporary or project type experiences. Maybe what you can do is, instead of having them known as work experience or professional experience, you can change it up to say freelance and research experience or freelance and project experience, and then collate those experiences in a specific section. So instead of just calling them temporary job assignments, you can rename it as, project and freelance experience, and then you can highlight specific projects you've handled in that period of time. It could be the 3 temping projects that you've done. You can highlight the organization, the role that you actually had in making those projects happen, and have a separate section for that. So at least when I look at the resume, I know that, okay, so you're trying to compartmentalize what you do on a freelance or temporary basis versus, more conventional day jobs in that case.
Great. Thank you so much for that.
Okay.
So I think we will conclude today's webinar. Thank you again, Josephine, for joining us and presenting to the group today. For everyone on the line, please watch your email for a link to a recording of today's presentation, as well as a follow-up survey. And you are invited to join us online on our website, which is careers.uchicagoalumni.org. And there you can check out our upcoming events, recordings of past webinars, and let us know when you've hired another UChicago graduate at your organization. So again, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you at tomorrow's presentation. Same time, same place. It'll be noon Central Time. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and have a good rest of the day.